Ever complete a game then get so captivated by its story that you end up thinking about its premise 10, even 20 years after you've beaten it? Well, that is what Xenogears is to me. Indeed, there may never have been an RPG as complex and ambitious as Xenogears was. Truly a gem of a game, it was released during a monumental age of gaming, and has managed to outshine and outlast some of the genre's best works. The game's attracted an impressive cult following of fans, many of whom long for more. Xenogears isn't without faults, however. The game was the masterwork of Tetsuya Takahashi, originally part of Squaresoft's Final Fantasy team. Takahashi had worked on Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy VI, and Chrono Trigger. For Final Fantasy VI, he is credited with designing the game's Magitech armor, which played a key role in the plot. For Chrono Trigger, he also served as the graphics director. Through his years as a game designer, Takahashi longed to create and direct his own game entirely under his own vision. Therefore, he and his wife Kaori Tanaka joined together to create an original story, which would become Xenogears. Tanaka also had much experience in the gaming industry and was involved in the design of Final Fantasy IV, Romancing Saga, and Final Fantasy V and VI. Originally considered as a potential plot for Final Fantasy VII, the concept for Xenogears was perceived as too dark and complicated for a Final Fantasy title. Takahashi and Tanaka still wished to bring their ideas to fruition though, and refused to give up. Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi realized Takahashi's intensity and talent, and eventually gave him the opportunity to create the game under an independent title, originally called Project Noah. And, as evidenced by this retrospective, I'm certainly glad he did. After Takahashi received the go-ahead, the game was originally planned to be a sequel to Chrono Trigger, but after several internal disputes, it was determined that it would be published as a separate title. This decision allowed Takahashi and Tanaka a lot more creative license, and allowed them to bring forth both fantasy and science fiction elements into the game. Even still, much of the team that had worked on Chrono Trigger was involved in the development of Xenogears, including music composer Yasunori Mitsuda. Sakaguchi himself served as the game's executive director. Development on Xenogears lasted for about 2 years, and the project included a staff of about 30. The game was created in parallel with other larger Squaresoft projects such as the Final Fantasy series, and suffered from budget limitations as a result. Because the game took so much time to create, production was almost halted until Takahashi secured a compromise that allowed him to streamline content on the game's second disc, rather than to end the game abruptly at the end of the first disc. The second disc of Xenogears is almost fully narrated, without leaving the player to roam around the world, as was done in the first disc. The game even goes as far as to describe the team's descent into dungeons, breaking into gameplay only for a boss at times. Other than the final dungeon and a few optional storyline sequences, there just isn't much left to the discretion of the player himself on the second disc. Critics of the game have often pointed to the stark contrast that exists between the two discs, and these circumstances seem to explain the radical differences between them. Both Takahashi and his wife were deeply interested in philosophy and psychoanalysis, which can be clearly seen in the game itself. Xenogears is filled with influences from Sigmund Freud to Carl Jung and Friedrich Nietzsche. The main character's mother is even named after Karen Horney, a German psychoanalyst who made her own important contributions to the science. According to Tanaka, the game's central focus involved 3 elements: where do we come from, what are we, and where are we going? And that can be seen in Xenogears for sure. Sigmund Freud influenced the game through his theory of the id, a disorganized personality structure that drives a person's instincts. Freud described it the following way: it is the dark, inaccessible part of our personality. What little we know of it, we have learned from our study of the dream work and of course the construction of neurotic symptoms. And most of that is of a negative character and can be described only as a contrast to the ego. We approach the id with analogies. We call it a chaos, a cauldron full of seething excitations. It is filled with energy reaching it from the instincts, but it has no organization, produces no collective will, but only a striving to bring about the satisfaction of the instinctual needs subject to the observance of the pleasure principle. As those who have played Xenogears can see, these ideas relate strongly to Faye and his split persona, which is appropriately called id. In the game, it is most certainly a cauldron full of seething excitations. Additionally, the idea of a supernatural entity that forces humans to live out their lives in endless cycles can be traced, among other places, to Nietzsche's theory of the eternal recurrence. Nietzsche described the phenomenon this way: "Your whole life, like a sandglass, will always be reversed and will ever run out again. A long minute of time will elapse until all those conditions out of which you were evolved return in the wheel of the cosmic process. And then you will find every pain and every pleasure, every friend and every enemy, every hope and every error, every blade of grass and every ray of sunshine once more, and the whole fabric of things which make up your life. This ring in which you are but a grain will glitter afresh forever." Xenogears revolves around the cyclical cleansing of humanity and the resurrection of certain forces and characters, including Faye, Ellie, Myong, and Deus. In this way, Nietzsche's ideas seem to be unmistakably grafted into the soul of the game. There are numerous biblical and semi-biblical references in the game as well, such as Lost Jerusalem, the Gospel, Babel Tower, and there are even several scenes that seem to depict crucifixions. Richard Honeywood, the game's translator, reflected upon the hours of agonizing work he put into Xenogears as a result of these factors. "It was the project from hell. Translators walked off it. One reason was that it was too technical, and the other was the religious content. They took every biblical reference they could and tried to twist it. So I had 2 translators walk off it, and I was stuck there by myself." Honeywood also revealed an interesting episode in which he had to convince the game's designers not to name the god in the game Yahweh, a direct reference to the Judaic god, and eventually got his wish. In the North American game, it is named Deus. At one time in 1997, a spokesperson from Squaresoft even admitted at one point that the game would not come out in North America due to, quote, "sensitive religious issues." I speak for all North American fans of the game by expressing relief that they eventually reversed course on this decision. However, it's important to note that the game's religious influences seem to be derived more from Gnosticism than traditional Judaism or Christianity. For instance, Xenogears focuses greatly on characters that shun the material world, viewing it as the corrupt and illegitimate product of a demiurge, a supernatural, godlike being that is unaware or opposed to the true, superior god. Additionally, the phenomenon of killing humanity off in cycles is also sometimes associated with Gnostic ideas. These principles can be seen in Xenogears regularly, especially as it relates to the characters of Myong, Deus, and the wave existence. Also demonstrated over the course of the game, Takahashi and Tanaka also had a shared interest in science fiction. Among other sources, the movies 2001: A Space Odyssey and Soylent Green seem to have influenced the game's plot to a large degree. The Zohar from Xenogears, a mysterious otherworldly battery of immense supernatural power, seems to share several parallels with the Monolith from 2001. In both stories, the Zohar and the Monolith drive humanity to progress with technological development and space travel, and trigger a considerable shift in human evolution. When it comes to Soylent Green, several ideas from that movie also play a key role in the plot of Xenogears. This can be seen in Solaris, the advanced society in the skies which turns humans into food and medicine at the aptly named Soylent System facility. The story of Xenogears is possibly the most critically acclaimed facet of the game. It's simply enormous. There's no other way to say it. It's so enormous, in fact, that the game's story is probably more ambitious and extensive than any other RPG in history. The game is packed with hours of dialogue and storyline scenes, and there are times in the game where these segments can last for up to an hour at a time. It's definitely no exaggeration to call Xenogears an epic tale of immense proportions. In the world of Xenogears, the 2 ancient kingdoms of Ava and Kislev have been at war with each other for so long that neither side remembers the reasons for which the conflict began. You begin the game as Fei Fong Wong, a talented young painter in the village of Lahan. Faye is also an experienced martial artist, but he has no memories of his past. Several years before the game's events, Faye arrived in Lahan under mysterious circumstances. As the game begins, Faye's good friends Timothy and Alice are about to be married. Faye therefore ventures to the home of Dr. Saitan Uzuki, a friend who possesses photography equipment Faye wishes to use for the wedding. Suddenly, a group of gears, huge robots with magical powers, approach Lahan by air. Faye makes it back, but the gears storm through the village and begin to ransack it. Faye finds an unmanned gear, Weltall, and jumps inside. Without realizing it, he has the power to control the gear and fight back. In the process, the entire village of Lahan is destroyed, and Alice is killed. Faye is blamed for the town's obliteration, and Alice's brother calls him a murderer. Completely distraught, Faye is exiled from the village after his friends blame him for the destruction of Lahan. Faye soon runs into Elham van Houten, or Ellie, a skilled young officer of Gebler, the military branch of Solaris. She is the daughter of Eric van Houten, who is part of Solaris' Imperial Guard. One of the most important characters in the game, Ellie also becomes integral to the game's story. Saitan, who eventually meets up with Faye again, becomes another permanent companion. Oh, and later in the game he gets a sword. That's right, a sword. As if Saitan could be any cooler than he already was. Bartholomew Fatima, or Bart, acts as the ill-tempered leader of a group of sand pirates that ravage the Ignis Desert. However, he is really the crown prince of the Fatima dynasty, making him a descendant of the founder of Ava. He provides some excellent comedic relief in an otherwise serious and dark game. Maria is the daughter of Chevet gear designer Nikolai Balthazar, and defends the floating nation from all who would try to attack it with her powerful gear, Siebzane. Billy is a priest of the Ethos religion, committed to purging the wells from the world. He has a strained and problematic relationship with his father, Josiah. Without a doubt, he is the coolest gunslinging pacifist in the world of Xenogears. Rico is a mutant-like demi-human who has been prisoner at the Kislev camp. The battle champion of Nortune, he is the son of Kaiser Sigmund, who extends no toleration to demi-humans, which strains his relationship with his father. Emeralda is a 4,000-year-old nanomachine colony constructed by the brilliant scientist Kim. She was created to bring purity to the world and rise above the flawed nature of humanity. And then there's Choo Choo, who is, Choo Choo, a creature of a near-extinct race that can grow to the size of a gear. The cast of characters in the game is very good overall, but some of them get overshadowed quickly after meeting them. For instance, Rico comes to mind. A great character with an interesting story, the game passes Rico by rather quickly. Faye, Ellie, Bart, and Saitan seem to play the biggest roles as far as the protagonists go. The game's villains are incredibly interesting and complex, much more so than other games in the genre. Although some classic villain archetypes are explored in Xenogears, the game throws many twists and turns into the narrative and persuades the player that the characters aren't always what they first seem to be. I noticed this especially with Kane, Krellian, and Graf. In fact, Graf may be my favorite character in the entire game. Appearing at first to be a dull, power-obsessed villain, once you learn his backstory and motivations, everything becomes clear. He also plays a key role in the character development of Faye. If there is one antagonist that should be meticulously followed by the player through the story, I think it should be Graf. Though it may seem tedious to some players, I very much enjoyed the detailed conversations that take place between the villains. These conversations give the characters more depth and reveals their motivations better than if those scenes weren't shown at all. This avoids making the game's villains into simple-minded cliches that you often find in other games. Though the loads of information delivered in the game's storyline segments in general can seem overwhelming, it adds to the intricacy and uniqueness of the story, which is one of the defining characteristics of Xenogears. It's one of the reasons why the game has so many fans. The game's story also features anime-based videos, and this was the first time this had ever been done in a Squaresoft game. It adds a lot to the story and characters, although there aren't that many. Combat in Xenogears takes two general forms, regular battles and gear battles. The game's story determines whether you do a normal dungeon on foot with regular battles or take the helm of your gear to fight through gear battles. The end of the story seems more driven to gear battles, however. In ground combat, the player has a set amount of points to unleash attacks. Each character's combo points are depleted at a certain rate, based upon the button pressed during the attack. Triangle is a weak attack but only uses 1 point, Square is a medium attack that uses 2 points, and X is a powerful attack that uses 3 points. The player can also pool combo points by not using the full amount each turn. This can be used to create longer attack combinations in future rounds. Some attack combinations form predefined attack patterns known as death blows. Death blows do a tremendous amount of damage and can be learned throughout the game. The death blow system is a fun, unique facet of combat that keeps battles from becoming too repetitive or mundane. They also use awesome, complex sprite animations and bold sound effects to drive in the magnitude of the attacks. They are also incredibly powerful. However, it is usually a good rule of thumb that the most complex death blows learned do the most damage, and this can start to make the older death blows more irrelevant as the game goes on. Learning death blows is a bit confusing, and the game does almost nothing to show you how they work or how they're learned. In actuality, you gain a kind of experience points with each individual attack, and you don't learn new death blows until you've done enough of the certain types of attack the game is looking for. In addition to death blows, each character also has special abilities that can be used in battle. For instance, Faye's Chi abilities can boost stats and cause damage. Ellie's Ether can do elemental damage, and Maria's Control can do high damage weapon attacks. In gear battles, each gear has a set fuel gauge that gets depleted over the course of the battle based upon the fuel cost of each attack. Death blows are available here as well, but they are only unlocked when you learn the death blows from ground combat. To use the most powerful gear attacks, the gear's attack meter in the lower left corner of the screen has to be built up to higher levels. Gears can also use Ether Machine, where each character has a different set of special attacks that do damage, boost stats, or affect the battle in other ways. This adds another dimension to the gear battles, much like the special abilities do for the ground battles. Customizing the gears in various ways is also another one of the most fun aspects of the game, and gear upgrades radically impact the performance of the gear. The importance of accessories on gears cannot be overstated, and some accessories offer important immunities or magical boosts. There is also great significance when it comes to how you upgrade your gears. Certain gear upgrades provide incredibly powerful upgrades, but at the cost of a low fuel gauge. Other upgrades are more balanced. Finding the proper upgrades to use is one factor of Xenogears that gives the player a sense of accomplishment and customization. As far as the graphics go, I think the developers made an appropriate choice by having the 2D character sprites on top of 3D backgrounds. The sprites are really great and don't look too cartoony like some of the 3D character models used in other RPGs for the PlayStation. The polygons in the world, the structures, and the gears are also beautiful and some of the most impressive from a PlayStation-era game. The graphics in this game certainly haven't aged as much as some of the other games from that time. The fully rotating camera is also a welcome feature of Xenogears that allows the player to feel part of a huge world. But there were some times where the high elevation of certain objects made it difficult to see what you're trying to find. I don't have many issues with how the dungeons were designed, but there are parts of the game where you run through several corridors or passageways that look almost the same. This can create a little confusion for the player. There are also a few obscure dungeon puzzles that are confounding and can bring annoyance, and these devices can cause the player to spend a long amount of time in certain areas. The musical score in Xenogears was the masterwork of Yasunori Mitsuda, and it is simply breathtaking. Mitsuda had previously composed the Chrono Trigger soundtrack, which won critical acclaim for its variety and complexity. His unmistakable style is back yet again in Xenogears, with even more musical influences this time. Some of my favorite tracks in the game include Emotions, Bonds of Sea and Fire, and Wings, all of which are in this video. The soundtrack is full of songs that will stick in your head, and certainly they all convey a particular mood aimed for in the story. Honestly, I think the soundtrack rivals some of the greatest RPG scores in history, including Final Fantasy VI and VII. It really is that great. The only complaint I can make against the score is that there simply isn't enough here. What is on the soundtrack is amazing. However, according to GameFAQs, the length of the game for an average player is about 70 hours. For this amount of time, 44 tracks is just not enough. This lack of variety is evident throughout the game, where tracks are often reused, and there are times in the game in which no music plays at all. There are even event storyline scenes at times where music plays that doesn't seem to belong or fit the scene at all. This is an unfortunate defect in an otherwise awesome game. The shortness of the score may be explained by the circumstances noted before concerning the game's development. The tracks are truly A+ caliber, but there just isn't enough, and they are sometimes misused. That being said, the soundtrack is still one of the high points of the game. As far as criticisms go, the first and foremost on my mind is that the game just seems incomplete. This can be especially seen in the Disc 2 narration scenes, which seem rushed and put together in a hurry. In Disc 2, the player isn't given the freedom to roam around the world any longer, and there just isn't as much variety offered. The story itself is great, it's just delivered in a way that the player wouldn't be expecting, having just finished the first disc. None of this is a knock on what's currently in the game itself. I just imagine how incredibly amazing the game could have been with enough time and attention. The camera is a little bit odd at times, but that's just a minor gripe that only applies to certain locations with certain objects that impede the view. There's some real character imbalance, and certain characters seem to be relatively discarded once their storyline segments are complete. After Xenogears was released, it was a smash hit in Japan, selling almost 1 million copies by the end of 1998. As of 2003, it had sold well over 1 million copies worldwide, including 280,000 outside of Japan. After the game was completed, Takahashi began to develop a sequel to it for the PlayStation, but the project never came to fruition, and he eventually left Squaresoft to form Monolith Soft. Under the Monolith Soft name, and with some help from Namco, he created and directed the Xenosaga series. The Xenosaga games are not direct sequels or prequels to Xenogears, but they contain many similar elements. It's probably fair to say that the Xenosaga games are the spiritual successors to Xenogears. All in all, Xenogears is a fantastic game that should be played by all fans of console role-playing games. Its strengths definitely outweigh the weaknesses, and the game brings so many redeemable elements that I'm willing to forgive the incomplete nature of it. As far as I'm concerned, it's one of the best RPGs ever, and definitely deserves to be played today. And that will do it for my retrospective and review on Xenogears. If you like this video, please comment on it, subscribe to the channel, and check out my other videos.